I don't know what to tell you, or read to you, or share with you. I haven't thought about it, which I think is always the best form of preparation. Just see what happens. So I'll read the first poem in my first book, and then we'll see where that goes. And just see if any of the things make any sense. And if they don't, or if they don't connect to things, that doesn't bother me in the slightest. So the poem is called House. Water clanks from the tap like a chain. A lifetime since anything has moved here, but rats and birds. I see the last inhabitants as a father and son. The father sending the son off to the city with a handshake and a pocket of old pound notes. He might as well be sending him to bring home the time without a watch to carry it. You get it? And that's what it feels like always to me when I come to a place like Monasterevin that I don't know, but it was always on the periphery of my vision as a kid when I grew up and lived in Portlaoise, and we'd pass here and maybe stop for an ice cream. You'd be looking out and you'd be kind of thinking you recognise people. You'd recognise the head on some lad because he'd had a cousin over in Portlaoise or something, so it was home and it wasn't home. And someone was joking earlier about being something of an invasion, an infestation maybe of leash people here today. In the border you could spit and get over the border from here. They were kind of obsessed in Ireland, and maybe more in the Midlands, with all these little territories and townlands and all of that, and they're fascinating. They're fascinating for anybody who writes, because everyone feels that they own this place. And then they have to make new ownership when they move up the road, or when they move, like sister here, to Pakistan, and you have to reinvent who are you now in this new place. So place is always the fuse to creative work. And you can imagine when Hopkins was here the 6 or 7 times he spent a few days here and in this room, and looking out that window, he wouldn't have seen willoughbys, maybe the back of the woods then, but he saw something else, and what that place would have meant, and having the river here would have meant. You know, and you can be pretty sure that the first time he came, that was what brought him back the second time. Our unfinished business with place is the fascination, I think, of Irish writing. And I'm not that original, I'm afraid. But houses are my thing, because I had two things feeding into what became an obsession as a kid. I grew up on the main street, as some of you know, in Portlaoise, up the road or over the road. And my father had 2 different businesses, or 2 different sources of income. One was he was a travel agent, so he was constantly sending people away to discover things about themselves that they may or may not want to have known, and then coming back with the news. And that's as old as literature gets. Someone goes and sees something and comes back and tells it. You know, Canterbury Tales is on your way out, Star Trek is on your way back. You know, they're the 2 motions. So he was tapped into that, and we as kids in that house, we were watching all these people coming with their bags to go places, and we weren't going. That's so fascinating, because you can't stop your imagination going with somebody, you know. So that was one of the things. But the other thing that he did was equally connected, that I didn't see it then, was equally connected to travel. He was an agent for GWI, Gowan Wood Industries in Sligo, and they sold doors and windows, mostly just cheap deal frames, not these beautiful sash or this Honduras mahogany that we were talking about earlier. But as kids, we'd come in from school and we'd help them load up this Volkswagen van to head to points imaginary like Monasterevin or Kildare or wherever, to deliver these doors and windows, and sometimes we'd have to go with them, and we'd go very begrudgingly, and we'd meet some builder out in a field, and there was nothing there except the lines of the foundation and maybe a few walls, and we were going, jeez, you know, look at this place. But once the doors and windows arrived, a house started to become a reality. And where you have a house, then you have all of the attendant possibilities. So houses were, and that idea of building and making and constructing were always big things for us as kids. Just going to jump around and see if I can find something that maybe it's much later that connects to that. Let's see. I can never remember where anything is anymore. Oh yeah, well no, that's the end. I could just go straight to the end. No, I'll tell you. Doors and windows. My father sold them. Doors and windows. Entrances, exits. Idyllic views from houses not constructed yet, though mapped out with such absolute precision that those wooden frames we'd spend evenings stacking to the sky, then half days driving and unloading in windswept fields, before our eyes transformed. Fingers smarting from the rasp of wood, I'd press a fist into my palm, count to 10 and watch my breath trace silent protest in the air. Then count to 10 again, while he, as I now know in his own way, saliva in his palm, secured the deal and made a friend he hoped would someday pay, though many never did. And then we were off. The builders stood there, watching through the glass that wasn't even in those windows yet. And overhead, the Milky Way already settling into place. Because that's of course what happened. Everything was done on, as they used to say, tick, and he'd hand over and he'd be gone, and when he was gone, he was gone. And as a kid you don't see that, but you'd start to think you see it. And that's the real interesting thing, that, you know, when people talk about, I used to run lots of writing workshops, and most people, when they're trying to get their muscles into writing, they're thinking about what are they writing about. And often I think it's the wrong way to think about it. You know, there's the glass, and I've got to write about the glass. But it's much more useful to think about writing about the glass, the things that are about the glass, this phone, those books, that table, that cushion. They're things that are about the glass. They're drawn into the glass's orbit for the length of the duration of the focus of the poem. So the poem is aimed at the glass, or it's aimed at the window, or it's aimed at a flower. But it's not about a flower. It's not about the window. Do you know what I'm saying? And I think we know this, but we don't really kind of talk about it very much. We fixate, we slightly obsess about the detail of the poem, but that's only to hypnotize you, to distract you, to beguile you, to get its hand in your pocket or your purse. It's only something to show you. It's like Kafafi said, it's something to dazzle barbarians, you know. And like when we came in and Richard took down this globe here off the table. It's a beautiful thing, but it is something to dazzle barbarians. This is because I look at it, think, wow, look at that, you know. And it's a kind of an earth thing. So you can see that I haven't any idea what I'm going to tell you that I'm talking about. But if you can handle it, I can handle it. I'll tell you something about my father. Because we're in a house with such, I'm sure, an amazing history. And I've never been in here before. But I was talking to one of the sisters here in the garden about being on a mission. And she was telling me she's been here for the last 5 years. And a number of members of my father's family were missionaries and had that experience of having to go and reinvent and earth somewhere that in which they were, in the real sense of the word, alien presences for a period, and then put down kind of roots. Hello, you can take off your thing if you're hot, because you will be. So this is a poem that's not about that at all. But my father was from over another border, just into Kilkenny, Crut, just short of Castlecomer. And I remember him telling us when we were kids once that he learned to swim by his father just getting him, fecking him out of a boat, which I think is, it's a way of achieving the purpose when it works. When it works. That's the content advisory on the end of this. Faith. Pushed out of the boat, my father, like so many of his siblings, learned to swim out of necessity. He'd seen, no doubt, a sack of cats go down into the same Dynon River, and might well have dreamed the blackness at the far end of that string of beads, those seeds of air that rose to bloom and blossom on the water skin. And perhaps that helped. More likely though, fear moved faster through his veins than any conscious thought. And he was kicking water, grasping, gulping air, almost before he knew he'd been pushed in. His father, extending from that small craft an arm or a splintered oar with which to fish him out, still gasping, into an ark. Again, I think those of you that, if you've been reading Hopkins, which I imagine many of you in this room have for a lot of your lives, the poems don't stay still. They change. They mean different things to you on different days, at different times of your life, when you're, when you're on an up or on a down, as they say, the young folk these days. But then that's the thing about them. They're, as I said, they're about things, but they're earthing a number of things, but they're also reflecting things. So they have things to say about yourself, and I think that's the difference now. To go off on a complete tangent, but that's the difference I think between scripture and literature. That scripture is attempting. I'm thinking of the poem Faith. It's attempting to say that there is something there, and it's going to come through me, and I'm going to pass it on to the community, however big or small the community is. But literature is not coming from the outside, and poetry even more so. And for that reason, it can sometimes take you to places that that you don't want to go, or that you don't know the meaning of. That it can come in light like a bird in the tree, and have something to tell you, or the ashling figure, and have something to impart, verbally or not verbally. It can be a message, or feel like a message, but you don't have the consolation that it's from himself above, if that's who you believe in or what you believe in. So the voice is sometimes in contradiction of the other accepted stories and accepted voices you hear. And I think that's troubling for anybody who's engaged not just in the literary arts but in any art form, that you have to be open to messages, but you don't always know what the messages are, and sometimes you don't even agree with them. This is a poem called Because the Milky Way. Now I know what this is about, you guys don't. I know what the connection is, so I'll tell you what it is. It's milk. The previous poem had the Milky Way through the window, and this poem's called Milkman. And it's just because we were talking about the main street and the shops on the main street, and the mockler wheeling up the butcher 4 doors up, etc., and the characters that would come and go. when I was very small, I think it was Fingleton's, used to come with the gallon of milk. We had the gallon, they would come and fill the gallon. There'd be a knock on the door, and they'd fill the gallon every few days. We'd bring it down to the back of the room, where it was back of the shop, as my father called it, where it was tiled to keep it cold because there was no fridge. He eventually bought a safe in a sale, a safe with at the door, and that became our fridge. So much so that when I forget, I still call fridges safes. I say to my kids, one of them's now 21, which take the milk out of the safe. So language follows. Language is always catching up. Milkmen. The doorbell rings. I go. I'm 14. That's how it is. No need to stop or think. It's the milkman's eldest son, putting a brave face on it, wearing his father's shade. So quietly he pours the milk. Pours its at first almost thin, then rolled, then muddy sound, until the gallon is filled. I close the door and wait for the milk to settle down. Years later, for it is years already, I begin to know what it means, this opening of doors, of silences, to accept things not made on the spot, but handed over. Love, inheritance. I've published nearly 30 books because I'm a kind of an obsessive, and I'm always doing something. I'm always at something, as my mother used to say. Not always in a complimentary sense, but just I'm always busy. I have one of those minds, and if I'm not, I'm in trouble with somebody. But the thing is, I keep going back to a period when I knew less about the world than I know now. And that seems contradictory. If you think of all the stuff you hear about writing, write about what you know, and all of that, it's all nonsense. It's complete and utter nonsense. You don't write about what you know. You write about what you want to know. You write about what you can't understand. You write about what niggles you, what keeps changing, what shimmers, what refuses you, what rejects you, what hurts you, what mystifies you, what disappoints you. That's what you keep going back to. You scratch the itch. And I think a lot of people, the obvious one, I suppose, for our generation is Heaney, how much of the earth of his writing was from his childhood. And but it's not. I don't feel it was nostalgic writing. It's writing because as the distance expands, so does the perspective change. So there's new things. There's always new things to say about what happened, and they're only in a very illusory sense. They're past and finished. They're not. And there's always something about the past, when you're in an encounter with someone, that you say the right thing about the past or the wrong thing. You can penetrate right into who a person is. Whereas if the subject matter is the present, it's much more difficult because we don't live in the present, despite all the guru nonsense. Emotionally we don't. We want to because we don't want to be trapped by this other thing. But we, our hearts are in the past. I think we know that. I was in a prison about 20 years ago. I was in the prison, I suppose you could say. I know where I am. In Portlaoise, in the political wing, and we were trying to have a kind of a workshop. And I was trying to encourage this young man to open up and write something more revealing, and it was one of those situations where it was difficult for him and it was difficult for me, and it was but I said, just kind of flippantly, without planning it or thinking it, I said something like, I was trying to get him to go back to his childhood, to get beyond the screen of who he was and who I was. And I said, do you not remember, I was talking about myself, I said, do you not remember when you were a young fellow in your backyard and the breeze block wall went all the way back down to the house behind you? That's not actually my experience, it isn't the house I live in now. So I was riffing, do you know what I'm saying? So I said the breeze block wall went all the way down, and when you were, excuse the language, when you were pissed off with your old man, you'd go out and you'd hammer the ball as hard as you could against that wall. Because I'd seen it happen 100 times, I'd seen my own kids doing it, and the next thing I could see the tears starting to fall on his face, and he couldn't put his hand up because he was in a room with 5, I think it was, other guys, and all they were able to do was keep a mask on all the time. So he couldn't look weak in that moment. And it was just an accident that in trying to describe something that's not a cliche, but something that I had plucked out of the air, I hit the spot. I hit the target exactly. If I'd spent an hour planning it, I couldn't have done it. Do you know what I'm saying? So nothing. So that's the fact. I don't know what that's about. I'm just trying to tell you things that are more interesting than my poems. Let me see. What else? The last few years, since COVID, I started making small films. I've made about 20 films in the last 3 years. Most of them are only a few minutes long, but some of them, one of them took me 6 months to make, because I have a really awkward way of doing it. But the reason I was doing them is because, again, like the aboutness, that they can be looking at something. And it made me realise that my own activity writing is nearly always, is nearly always visual. I won't say painterly, because that sounds a bit pretentious, but it's not exactly photographic because it's not always accurate. And that in trying to just describe something, the other stuff comes in. And the mistake I think I used to make, and I'm sure I'm speaking for a lot of people in the room who write or have written, is you tend to tell too much. And you don't leave room for the listener, the reader, to enter. So you put a wall, you look at this, look at this, look at this. But actually the truth is that most of us have seen more movies and TV shows than we have read books, like by a factor of hundreds. And we've learned, even my elderly mother, who was kind of mystified about what was going on in a lot of programs at a stage, she still knew the language of editing in a way that still amazes me. So when it showed this guy's face and then it showed the garden, she knew that the camera had moved from here to there. And when it showed this guy's face and then it showed his hair wet, it meant either he was after having a shower or he was after swimming or it was rain. Do you know what I'm saying? The viewer puts a lot of that together. And we understand it. Nobody's ever explained. If you were now 10 years of age and you saw the program you watched last night on television or Netflix, you'd be absolutely mesmerised. You wouldn't know what's going on. Because you've learned the language of television in the last few years. When, I don't know if any of you remember, when Hill Street Blues was a big show, you do, I don't know, 35 years ago? Everyone was stunned by it because it was the first time where they were shooting two people like this, talking, walking down a corridor, and they'd have all extras going like that. Someone going with a cup of coffee, and someone going over, and they'd have all this going on. And if you look, which I do because I'm a nerd, if you look at the reviews in the newspapers at the time, all the reviewers are saying it was so hard to concentrate because there's so many people going around, there's all this business in the background. Now if you watch a show that doesn't have that, you think this is ridiculous. It's so static, it's so dead. So you learn the language of the medium by being around it. What's that got to do with anything? I don't know. This poem called, I'll just keep reading different poems, will I? And then I'll stop, and that'll be the end. This poem is called, no, okay. This is a poem called, what's it called? Is this making sense to you? Is this kind of what you're fearing? Is it? I don't want to be too boring.
No, that's fine.
It's fine. Okay. All right. I'm just trying to see.
No, nobody has walked out.
Okay. Well, no, that's sometimes intimidation is sometimes a good thing. I'm just trying to see. Oh no, I was going to say something. That's interesting. I was going to say that the temptation is to because we're near a place I know pretty well, or at least in my obsession or my imagination, that's what you're interested in. But again, it's the hook. I'm not really that interested in the place. So so what else is there? Because we'll fight each other about place, and we'll wave the flag, and if Camross are playing Portlaoise, you better know whose side you're on. Do you know what I mean? But yet, if you put those two opposing supporters on a back street in Sydney, Australia, some Friday night, and they bump into each other, it's an instant love affair, because they amount to more than the sum of their parts. Do you know? So we're prepared to let go of place as well. I'm going to read you something that makes sense to me. Don't know where it is now. I don't mind this part where things all fall apart. It's not bad. I completely can't remember where this is. Might even be the wrong book. Oh yeah. So near me, I live in Baldoyle now, which is not far from, it's kind of short of Holt, between Holt and the airport, let's say. And there's two level crossings near us. One if you were going towards Holt, and one if you're going back towards the city. So I'm kind of ferrying back and forth, or was at the time I wrote this. My 2 kids, I'm going to the post office, I run a little business at home, so I'm constantly back and forth to the post office. So a number of times a week, if not a day, I'm stopped at the level crossing. And that's what the poem is about. Station Road. There is that moment when the barrier comes down on Station Road, when the train to Holt has passed and nothing happens. When the men in lycra vests and shorts on their blade-thin wheels look round and through each other. When the yummy mums with their dozy, school-bound offspring by their sides, or trussed up in the seats behind like dolls, glance down one more time to check the time. When the very birds up on that ever slack tangle of cables shuffle 2 steps left or 1 step right. When the sea retreats and only sunlight advances along the tracks. When something in the chest unlocks or shifts, and you find you're no longer waiting. When the barrier lifts. That's a poem about a place, and it was given to me in a sense. I ended up making a film of it because it's so obviously just a lot of pictures. But you could say that sense of being prevented following the necessary immediate journey that you're on, the initial reaction to that frustration, you can live in that frustration, and you can hold on to it, and you can defend it, and you can bring it home, and I can say to herself, don't guess what happened to me today. I just, you know, and you can hand it on to somebody else. And that can be the treasure you find from the day. Or you can be lucky and I'm not necessarily saying spiritually evolved, but sometimes just lucky. And you can see yourself getting into that, the shoulders going up, and I am being thwarted, me, you know, of all people, me on my mission to do X, Y, and Z. And when you step out of yourself like that, when you enter the mirror and look back, it's much easier to let go, and then the barrier lifts. And the barrier is all the other barriers, of course. But again, see, what I'm saying, the reason I'm saying this, it's I'm trying not to look at myself in the mirror. That's why I'm leaning sideways. Who wants to be, you know, Dorian Gray for the night? But you know, that is the thing, isn't it? You're always trying to be. You're always trying to find a way to step out as well. To the viewing is in two directions. And by going back to the home place, the danger is that you go back to who you were in the home place. That's actually what I'm trying to say. That, like I've written that prose book about growing up in Portlaoise, and it's almost anything I can remember from the time. It's every character and all the stories and the yarns, and, you know, it's a swamp. In that sense, that if I put my foot in it, it kind of sucks me back in. But what it means to me now is much more interesting, because my kids have read it, and it was translated into Italian, and I met someone who read it who had never been to Ireland. And here's me defending Mockler Whalen and what he used to say to Eiley when someone came in about, do you know, my focus is like this close, and they don't even know what country this book is from. So what is the thing then? What is the made thing? You know, you do have to have the obsession and the focus, but you also have to realise you don't count in the end. You know, what got you into it is only an excuse. It's only something to get the ball rolling, and that's the freedom of it, I think. That you can by zooming into the local to do a Paddy Kavanagh on it, you can go well out beyond the local. I'll read you this little poem that was written for a small film a few years ago about Dick Sides. Some of you knew Dick Sides, who was my mother knew him practically all her life in Portlaoise, and I knew him, I got to know him because he was in the karate club with me when I was a kid, and he was also the band leader in town. He'd be out with the baton. I don't think anyone called it a baton, I think it was a stick back then. But because we lived on the middle of the main street, anytime there was anything going on, we'd all run. We'd hear dum, 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 you know, and we'd all run to the front windows. It'd be like turning on a whole lot of televisions in RTV at the same time, and pulling back all the curtains, and you'd have the whole spectacle, missing only the ticker tape and the astronauts. You know, bam, all that would go by, and we might get out and run after it when we were allowed. The band leader. Call it strange or odd, but what we loved when the marching band came proudly up the street, the ranks of players following the heartbeat of the big bass drum, was up front in white gloves, tossing his baton above his head, the band leader, marking time. We stood and stared, a lone guard, spectral at the crossroads, directed traffic. Children waved to shy musician siblings, suddenly mature in their outsized uniforms. But who could look away from this feat of anti-gravity, his skillful, sure mastery and control? Music played and filled the valley of the street, echoing off parked cars and plate glass windows where pale-faced dummies gazed like souls in limbo. And yet, for all the toing and froing, we loved it most when the band came to a halt, now and then, high-stepping on the spot, but going nowhere. A panto horse, waiting for its rear end to catch up. Odd to think that 50 years can pass in the blink of an eye. The world can change so much and still so little. But kids like to march and swing their arms. And if it seems strange that a walking stick might suddenly transform into a gleaming baton, who is he to complain? He listens for the music he carries within him, counts to himself for a moment, then they're off again. And the little scene in the film was a kind of a recreation of that 50-year concertining of those 50 years when he used to go down to the Presentation Convent in Portlaoise and with the cooperation of the sisters get the young girls out and form them into a band and have them march around and in a sense, you know, kind of own the street, own the town in a way that is much more profound, I think, at that time than we would see it now, you know. And I certainly, I know other people in the room remember it maybe better than I do, but I certainly had that very strong experience of seeing the older sisters and then with the band itself, with the town band, the St. Joseph's Accordion Band, seeing older siblings, brothers and sisters marching by, and it was like, you know, it was kind of like a liberating army in a way. It's hard to describe how momentous that was and the boom of it, you know, coming through, and just the tour of the town, and that was it, you know, kind of marking out the in my mind the fort that this is ours. we're still in possession in a way, you know. The small things. I'm preaching to the converted, I'm sure, but poems are always about small things. In fact, I don't think there's any poems about big things. I think they're made of small things, small parts. That's the risk, and they start to get sloppy if you try to make them too big. It doesn't mean they can't be ambitious, but they have to be, you know. So I'll maybe just read you one more, or if anybody wants to, you know, say anything or do anything, or I don't know. I was going to read you something, I just can't remember.
Did you into your films anywhere?
I did.
Did you go to festivals?
Yeah, I did.
Like what?
They showed in a lot of festivals.
Really?
Yeah,
Really?
mostly outside of Ireland.
For example?
Like the film. I don't know if the festival names would mean anything to anyone.
I work in the business, so I just...
Oh, sorry.
just
Okay,
curious.
sorry. Okay, that's what I'm trying to get a sense. But festivals are short films mostly.
Oh yeah.
But I also
Short.
translated lots of them into Italian, so I had them at lots of festivals in Italy and Sicily, and lots of festivals in India, the States, dedicated poetry festivals.
Oh, yeah.
They won a number of awards in kind of festivals, literary festivals for literary films, if you like.
Yeah.
And here, the Cork Film Festival, the Bloomsday.
Indie Cork, they have one. O'Bale.
Indie Cork,
Yeah.
O'Vale, number of films there. The Bloomsday Film Festival.
Oh,
In fact, I'll read you a poem. There was a festival an Irish festival for St. Patrick's Day. So I just can't remember where this poem is. In London, And the film of this poem, they showed it in Trafalgar Square to open the St. Patrick's Festival. I wasn't there, I didn't get to see it. But it meant a lot to me for a number of reasons. A number of reasons, including the fact that it's hard to be in this country at the moment and not be very concerned about what's going on in relation to our new inhabitants, our new short or long-term visitors, our relations with our nearest neighbour, and with ourselves as a tribe who have been taken in by so many countries over our glorious and not so glorious history, put it like that. And I think, you know, like maybe a lot of people in the room, I lived in London for a period in the 80s. It was after the No Dogs, No Irish period. But there was still the remnants of that around, that one wasn't always made to feel welcome. And now to be in the position where we are dealing with our own housing and other challenges, absolutely, that nobody can deny that. But that we're even questioning how we should deal with war refugees or people seeking asylum, it really bothers me. It really bothers me. I think we're being manipulated massively. I don't like this simplification of left and right and all that, but we're being manipulated by people who've never they've never kind of gone out in the world. I think that's the simplest way of saying it. And they don't understand what it is to be vulnerable or to be lost or to be at the mercy of the winds. It's a very worrying time, and I don't mean to bring us all down, but it is a very worrying time. So for me, you know, if you're right, even if you're right about, you know, Main Street, Portlaoise in 1970, God help us, as if anyone cared, you do, by focusing, to go back to the glass of water and not to give you a long lecture, but by focusing on something, you do draw in other things, and you draw in analogies, and you draw in connections and comparisons, even without trying to do it. And you know, it's a much more trivial thing, but I started talking about borders, the border between Kildare and Laois, or Laois and Kilkenny. And I know we're not talking about those borders, but they are borders. They are borders too. They're kind of mental borders, and we've learned by opposing each other over a football pitch, or in the pub, one end of the pub or the other end of the, we've learned not to engage in faction fights, which was how it was dealt with, you know, 180 years ago or less. Lads bet the heads off each other because they were different. You know, we learn to explore difference and to recognise it. So I think we have to be careful to recognise difference and not pretend it doesn't exist, that someone isn't different than us. Because I think that's a real danger, and that's the danger, I think, coming from the left at the moment, that we pretend we're all the same. We're not all the same. And you know, we can't blur that over. But the balancing or the unbalancing seesaw side to that is that we erect all these barriers between ourselves and others. So I want to read you this poem, but I was going to say, my father was from Kilkenny, and he was a blow-in in Portlaoise. And my mother was from Roscrage, she was a blow-in in Portlaoise. And we used to kind of laugh at this. Now to me, even though it's such a small thing, to me it's so important that there were blow-ins, that they weren't from there. And because they gave us a view from that window onto that street, but they also brought other windows with them. They had other experiences and other expectations. It means a lot. And my experience, which is very trivial, living in London, living in Brixton, in the mid 90s, makes this poem more important to me. The poem's called Immigrants Open Shops, and I had a friend, an Iraqi poet, who escaped from Iraq and managed to get away from the insane regime by walking through the desert. He ended up living in Berlin for a number of years, and I read poems that he'd written, and I invited him to a festival I was running in Dublin, and we became friends. So it's just simple. And he visited me a number of times when my kids were very small. And one night we were sitting in my kitchen, and there was a window like that onto the garden, and it was the end of this festival he had come over to be part of. And my kids, you know, after bouncing on his knee and all that and going off to bed, when Mrs. put the kids to bed, we started talking shite and drinking whiskey. And as it got darker, the garden disappeared and we appeared in the garden, reflected back in. That's the kind of the time arc of the poem. And his name was Sargon. And sorry, and in the course of one of these long, semi-drunken conversations about, you know, all of these things, about for him at the time in Berlin, about the rise of the right. He was a very brown-skinned man from the Middle East, and he was getting a lot of crap from people on the streets about being an Auslander and whatever else. So it was all that conversation, and I was kidding myself for imagining that Ireland was better. And that, you know, because we had had this experience as immigrants ourselves, that it would never really happen here, and all of that. We've all had this conversation. I'm not lecturing you, honestly. But at one stage he just said, in the conversation, something that really haunted me. And he said, I don't know exactly the line that came to it, but he said, immigrants open shops. And what he meant was that when you arrive into a place, you either get a job in the kitchens, because you can't speak the language, or you open, if you start to be a little bit prosperous, you open a corner shop. And I'm thinking, God, every shop where I lived in Brixton was Pakistani or Indian. Every one of them. And when I go back to Portlaoise 15 years ago, every shop was Polish. All the main street had become Polish. And now the main street is, you know, half Middle Eastern and, you know, a little bit further east. Do you know, it's the truth. That's what happened. And I just thought it was in 3 words. He had told the whole history of civilization, as far as I was concerned. So I'll just read you the poem, and that's me and my rambling lecture on I'm not sure what finished. But we started with a house, windows and doors, and we're going to end with a window. So it has a kind of a logic. Immigrants open shops. Immigrants open shops, Sargon says. In countries where they take in refugees, that's what they do. They open shops. To sell something, there's no real need to speak. Someone enters, points at this and that, or finds what he wants on a shelf. And all you need is half a dozen words to serve him. Yes, no, 7 euros, 10, he's counting fingers. Words a fool can master in a morning. Could be singing in 2 days. Maybe thank you or see you tomorrow. Immigrants, they open shops, Sargon says. Immigrants open shops, Sargon says. A teenaged girl perched high on a stool, happy to try the first new words she's learned after her first week in the local school. But when they pass through the bead curtains into the back room, when they step back from the till, or when friends or family drop by for a taste of the old country, it's the old language still. a newspaper lying open on the table, the TV always on the high shelf, making the drunk who stumbles in by accident wonder if he's the immigrant here himself. Immigrants opened shops, Sargon says, 8 years ago already. Hard to believe. The troops back then still gathering on the border of the homeland he hadn't seen in 20 years. One for the road? He asks. I shrug. Why not? As my mother says, would be a long time dead. Sargon smiles. I'll remember that, my friend. But he's far away this evening, lost in himself, gazing out into our tidy garden through his pale reflection in the glass. A nervous shopkeeper as night approaches, hearing ominous voices in the dark. That's it. Just going to play the piano.
So look, has anyone any questions for Pat? Anything he was speaking about or anything resonate with anyone?
Well, he brings up Clonaslee and Portlaoise, you know what he's talking about. These are two football hurling teams, and when they meet, sparks fly. And people on board, we're a border town here. I remember a guy said to me, you know, my wife has a car and I have a car. He says, one car with police registration, two. One. That was Joe Cosley, you know.